Recovering nonprofit CEO. I am the bossy older sister, so ran for 5th grade president, editor-in-chief of the campus paper to motivate people through passion and not necessarily through monetary means. Management and leadership through trial and error. Hire slowly, fire quickly. I learned the power of not trying to do everything by myself. Started working at the national headquarters. The thing about nonprofits is if you stick around long enough, you end up being promoted. An organization that identifies high-achieving, low-income middle school kids take on jobs that haven't been done before and for which there's no instruction manual. So it was 2005, and I left to become the executive director of our New York affiliate. Set up my email account, handed me the keys, and they're like, okay, bye, good luck. I had a staff of, including myself, 2.5 people. It's a very high-touch program model. Basically everything that a middle-class parent would provide: SAT prep, extra tutoring, high school placement, level the playing field for kids who have the talent but not necessarily the resources. From a scale perspective, we are not really able to serve a ton of kids. A bunch of seasonal interns who were our teaching staff. The early years were probably the toughest, but they're also the ones that I remember.
Why were they tough?
Really long days and really long nights and working weekends, but I really loved it. Felt like we were building something together. It felt like being in the trenches together. The rest of the money we had to raise either through individuals, foundations. It was a lick and a prayer, and we had to make do and make ends meet. And we made the decision to become a 501c3 and grow because our services were very much in demand. Recession Hits. So 2008, our board was incredibly supportive to reassure them that nobody was getting fired. We had put away some money for a rainy day, and this was a rainy day. And so we were lucky in that we were able to cut back where we had to, and we maintained and we stayed lean and we made it through. And actually I would say the downturn made us stronger in the end because we actually understood what it meant to survive in lean times. And so when things became a little looser and more of the resources were flowing, we had already trimmed down and become super efficient. Rhea, there's nothing harder in this world than raising a budget under $1 million. And I was like, I don't really know what to do with that information at that time. Many institutional donors don't want to be that big a percentage of your overall. An advocate of foundations acting more like VCs. This downturn is sort of fascinating to me, is it actually cleared the playing field for a lot of the weaker organizations that weren't sustainable. Winter came, and winter came hard. We survived. 12 to 30% year to year. Third site in the South Bronx. Grew both vertically and horizontally. Not what you're expecting to do with your own children. How can we expect to do that with other people's children? Success begets success. Carve out our own niche in a competitive market. There's enough room for everybody. You have to fix the plumbing before you can talk about the poetry. You can't run a 3-site organization the same way that you ran a 1-site organization. I think also being intentional about culture was a real hard lesson. Hope is not a strategy. Like I just kept hoping that they would get better, and you know they didn't, because in my heart I'm a startup entrepreneur. 6 months in advance of leaving that I tendering my resignation. A lady always knows when to leave a party. Working on my own consulting firm for nonprofits. I have a podcast, I have a blog. And I'm actually working on writing a book.
Welcome to Startup Hunter, also streaming on YouTube. We cover startups that are making it, have made it, have failed, and sometimes you bet on the jockey and not the horse. So I'm here with Rhea Wong and with our special guest,
Stevie Wonder.
Right down there, Stevie Wonder. And we're here on the Brooklyn Bridge in New York City. And Rhea is a non-profit CEO. So
recovering nonprofit CEO.
She's a recovering nonprofit
That's
CEO.
Right.
And she built an amazing organization. And that's why I'm having Rhea on this show. So let's start with your history of leadership.
Oh gosh, history of leadership.
And I want to go all the way back. Were you in the Girl Scouts? Were you in?
Oh my gosh, Hunter, you're going back in the day. Well, okay, so it probably started birth order. I am the oldest of a family of 3. I am the bossy older sister, so being in charge just felt very natural to me. I'm also going to try not to get hit by a car or bike on the Brooklyn Bridge. And then, gosh, let me think. So 5th grade, I think I ran for 5th grade president and got it. Middle school, I ran for 6th, 7th, and student body president. And then, high school, probably ran for some clubs. In college, I was the editor-in-chief of the campus paper.
Now, what school did you go to?
I went to McGill University, where you also went, Hunter.
Right.
The Harvard of the North.
What did you do in college?
What did I do in college? I didn't do a lot of the college-y things. I was a pretty big nerd. Studied political science, was working on this campus paper, which ended up being like 40 hours a week. So between going to school full-time and working on the paper, I didn't have much time to get into any trouble in college.
So what did you do? Were you a reporter?
I was a reporter, and then I was an editor. So I started as a news reporter, then I was a news editor, then I was the assistant ed-in-chief, and then my last year I was the ed-in-chief.
Oh!
So I thought I would be heading down a path of journalism. I worked for Mother Jones Magazine and the NBC affiliate in the San Francisco Bay Guardian.
Okay, we're going machine gun here. Let's go a little chronologically.
Okay.
So you're the editor-in-chief, and how is that? How many people were on the staff of the McGill? What was the name of the McGill?
The McGill Tribune. I'm surprised did you read it? You seem
no,
more of a daily guy.
I was totally running the computer systems at school.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And just like you, like for no pay, I assume, or did you get paid?
It was a very, very, very small stipend. It was coffee money, basically.
So yeah, I totally did not even read that. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. So at the time, gosh, on the staff, I can't even remember. We might have had like 10 people between layout, photography, and all of the different sections, and then we had a roster of writers.
Was it difficult motivating them? Like, did you find that you had to, do things, or were people generally like? Did you have a hand in selecting your staff?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did have a hand in selecting my staff, but actually, to be honest, I haven't thought about this in a really long time. And being on the campus paper was probably a really good practice for working a nonprofit, because a lot of what you have is to motivate people through passion and not necessarily through monetary means. And so I was really lucky. I made some of the best friends that I ever made in college on the paper. And it was a way of making a really big university feel small.
And how often was the paper coming out?
It was a weekly.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it was a pretty intense process. And actually, it's funny, one of my best friends I met on the paper, and she now lives 2 blocks away from me in Brooklyn.
Cool.
So I think I learned pretty early on about management and leadership through trial and error. And it certainly wasn't like there was any training program for me to learn about that. So I learned about budgeting, I learned about managing, and I was like, 19 or 20 years old. So
tell me about, you said trial and error. Tell me about what are the worst mistakes that,
oh my gosh,
that stick out to you from being the editor?
For being the editor, I don't know that I could speak to that, but I think in general, it's interesting. I had a meeting just this morning with a bunch of ED friends. I think some of the lessons I've learned were, one of the biggest lessons I learned was not firing quickly enough. So the old adage of hire slowly, fire quickly holds, and I think...
Okay, so wait a minute. You actually had the luxury in a student newspaper to fire people?
I mean, I guess technically I did. I didn't fire anyone at the student paper, but I suppose I did have the ability to do it if it was called for.
So you're talking about more in like...
I'm talking about like my nonprofit and professional life.
All right, but let's stay on the paper.
You want to stay on the paper? Gosh, that has literally been more than 20 years. Okay, so staying on the paper. I think I learned the power of not trying to do everything by myself. So it was a student-led paper. We were all full-time students, and it was a lesson in trusting people to do what they say they were going to do and letting go a little bit on the process and trusting that competent, smart people would produce good outcomes. Certainly a lesson in time management. I mean, being a full-time student at the same time as running a paper was a lot.
Okay, so
yeah.
You conclude at McGill, and then what's your next move?
I then went on to work briefly for Mother Jones magazine.
And where was that?
In San Francisco, where I'm from.
Okay.
Hometown. And I'd also taken a bunch of internships doing international things. So I did spend a summer in UNICEF in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
And so I thought I would be doing something like journalism or international relations. So I ended up at Mother Jones magazine, and sort of, this is the early 2000s, and kind of saw the writing on the wall as far as print journalism.
Yeah.
And so ended up getting a job at Breakthrough Collaborative, which is
what's that?
It's the nonprofit. It's the headquarters of the nonprofit I ran here in New York, and it was actually the program I was a part of when I was in middle school.
But what about? Didn't you go to graduate school, or is that later?
No, I never went to graduate school.
Oh.
I mean, I did some graduate work at Columbia Business School, but have not.
What's this about Harvard Kennedy School?
Oh, it's a certificate program, so it was like a continuing ed.
Got it.
So no, have not gone to grad school. I was busy building a nonprofit.
Okay, so here's where I am. You were in San Francisco.
I was in San Francisco. I started working at the national headquarters of the Breakthrough Collaborative.
Okay.
And I was, 22 years old. And, sort of the classic thing about nonprofits is if you stick around long enough, you end up being promoted because people leave. And so I started as a program assistant, literally like emptying mouse traps and filing and crawling under desks.
Okay, now what does Breakthrough do?
So we are, or I shouldn't say they, are an organization that identifies high-achieving, low-income middle school kids and supports them to and through college. We also...
Now, was that based in San Francisco?
It was based in San Francisco. It was started in San Francisco. There are 27 sites around the country and one in Hong Kong.
Oh, this is much bigger than I thought it was.
Yeah, it's major, Hunter. Anyway, so I started there. I was the one who started the first national teacher recruitment program. So we hire high school and college kids around the country to teach in our programs. And that was incredibly informative. It was very much trial and error again. I think the theme in my professional life is I take on jobs that haven't been done before and for which there's no instruction manual, and I figure it out.
Okay, so where were you based for this?
In San Francisco.
All 12 years?
No. So I was there for 3 years.
Okay, so let's talk about your first 3 years.
Uh-huh.
How many people are in this organization?
At the time, it was small, maybe 8 people in the national organization.
Okay.
And I started as an assistant, and then by the time I left, I was the recruitment and alumni manager.
And then you say by the time you left, so what did you leave for? What did you leave to?
So it was 2005, and I left to become the executive director of our New York affiliate, Breakthrough New York.
Uh-huh.
And that's the position that I was in for 12 and a half years.
Oh, so you've been with Breakthrough for like 15 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been a minute. I started when I was but a young thing. So I started in 2005. I was itching to leave San Francisco because it's my hometown and I love it, but the call of the wild was there.
Indeed.
And I was either going to be New York, Hong Kong, or the Peace Corps. So I was very close to going to West Africa. And
that didn't happen.
It didn't happen. New York put in an offer first. But also, I mean, I'll be honest, I sort of chickened out because they were most likely going to either placed me in somewhere in Western Africa, like the Côte d'Ivoire, or in Haiti, because I speak French. And to be honest, I chickened out when they asked me for my dental records, on the off chance that they would have to identify my body via my dental records.
Yeah.
And I was like, you know what? I'm gonna take my chances in New York City.
Yeah. Well, it's all, there's some crazy stuff here too, but maybe not that bad.
Well, I mean, when you hear some stories, especially out in the bush, I don't know. I'm bold, but I don't know if I'm quite that bold.
Okay, so you get to New York City
with
Breakthrough,
mm-hmm.
And are you like instantly in charge, or are you still not running the office here?
No, I was pretty much instantly in charge. So I was a 26-year-old executive director. Of course, no one really explained what that meant. They, set up my email account, handed me the keys, and they're like, okay, bye, good luck.
And did you have a staff here?
I had a staff of, including myself, 2.5 people, literally in a broom closet. I mean, it used to be the supply closet for the gym.
Now, tell me a little bit more about Breakthrough. Like, are you guys like really high touch, like individually talking, to
100%,
students?
Yeah, so it's a very high touch program model that we have. So we, like I said, we invest in our kids for 10 years apiece. And so what that means is in 6th grade, they apply to be part of the program. They have to be, high achieving, but from circumstances where their families wouldn't otherwise necessarily be able to afford extra academic and supplemental support. And we work with them, and we provide basically everything that a middle-class parent would provide: SAT prep, extra tutoring, high school placement, support during the high school years and the college years, help with finding internships, with the idea that we really want to level the playing field for kids who have the talent but not necessarily the resources, with the ultimate goal of breaking the cycle of poverty. Most of the kids that we serve would be the first in their families to go to college. And so we invest deep for 10 years. And so from a scale perspective, we are not really able to serve a ton of kids, but yearly we serve about 500 kids, which is pretty good.
Is it 2.5 of you in the office, and then you have other people working with you?
Yeah, so it's 2.5 of us in the office, and we had a bunch of seasonal interns who were our teaching staff, and we hired professional teachers to coach our teaching fellows, which is what we called them. So we had, in the early years, we probably had, call it around 30 people seasonally, interns and so forth. And the early years were probably the toughest, but they're also the ones that I remember.
Why were they
fondest. Tough? That was the time when we were starting up, and so we didn't have much money, and there were only 2.5 of us, so we had to figure everything out. And I just remember really long days and really long nights and working weekends, but I really loved it, and I had a great team. And so as we got bigger and things became more siloed and there were more departments, it was still fun. It was a different kind of challenge, but I think it's a little bit the nostalgia of startup, but I remember those days really fondly because it felt like we were building something together. It felt like being in the trenches together.
Okay, so you said you had a very little money. Tell me, where does the money come from? Private donations, grants, so other things?
Yeah, so in the early days we were lucky in that we were financially supported somewhat by our host institution, the town school up on the Upper East Side, as a service to the larger school community, and then the rest of the money we had to raise either through individuals, foundations, corporations, and so forth. And so in the early days, I think our entire budget was something like $200,000 a year, which I had to raise.
So is that including your salary?
Yep, that was including everyone's salary.
So you pay yourself a living wage of 30 grand a pop, bare poverty living wage. And because in New York City, 30 grand is below the poverty line.
Yeah, we were paying ourselves a little bit more than 30, but not by much.
So what does that leave over to run things?
It was a very lean operation, I will say that. I mean, I will say that the school was incredibly generous with a lot of in-kind support. But yeah, it was a lot of it was a lick and a prayer, and we had to make do and make ends meet and beg, borrow, and steal where we could. And not that I ever stole.
That's just an expression.
It's an expression, but yeah. Well, and in the early days, we only had 60 kids that we were serving per year, so it wasn't the same load. But yeah, we were always very, very lean and careful about where we were spending our money, because we were doing summer programs and after-school programs, so we had year-round programs that we had to serve.
Tell me, where should we go next from the early years to get us to the middle years? What do you remember? Interesting challenges?
Well, sort of in the middle of that.
Some good stories?
Yeah, so 2005 is when I started, and we were just getting going. And around early 2008, we made the decision to become a 501c3 and grow our organization.
Now, what predicated that decision? Why?
Primarily it was because we were under the auspices of the 501c3, which is a tax revenue classification by the IRS, meaning a nonprofit, under the town school, which was a private school, and we served public school students who came from very different socioeconomic backgrounds than most of the town school families. And the feeling was that we wanted to grow because our services were very much in demand. We had 3 applications for every spot that we could accept a student.
So there was a lot of demand, and you couldn't supply.
Right, and so we had to grow.
So you do the 501c3, you go out on your own.
Right.
A little, and
then the economic recession hits. So 2008 in the
yes.
fall. And I just remember it was the day that that Lehman Brothers went out of business.
Right.
And I remember sitting
in one of those buildings right there.
Yeah, over there. And I remember sitting at my desk, hearing the news, and just thinking, what have I done? What am I getting myself into? Have I just totally screwed us altogether?
So you're like, we're ready to go out on our own. We know it's going to be a big risk.
Yep.
And then at the same time that the financial crash happens. So what is the first thing, after you've overcome your shock, what is the first thing that you do, and where do you go next?
Well, we were lucky in many ways. At the time, our budget wasn't huge. I think our budget was maybe just a little under $500,000 a year at that point. So, it wasn't nothing, but it certainly wasn't, I wasn't looking at having to raise millions and millions. And I think a couple things happened. Our board was incredibly supportive, and so, while they...
So this is the San Francisco board?
No, this is our New York board.
Yeah.
So while they knew that, hard times were coming, I think they, as much as possible, tried to maintain their financial commitments. And I will hand it to a lot of our foundation funders. Now, they didn't really feel the pinch of having to restrict their gifts. A lot of our foundation partners were really, really supportive and fantastic. And I just got on the phone with everybody and I explained the situation, and I asked them to maintain their commitments. And then I talked to my staff, and I told them straight away that, again, we were a very lean staff. At that point, we were just 3 people, so it wasn't a huge staff to support, but I wanted to reassure them that nobody was getting fired. We were going to try to maintain as much as we could. And, luckily in those years, we had put away some money for a rainy day, and this was a rainy day. And so we were lucky in that we were able to cut back where we had to, and we maintained, and we stayed lean, and we made it through. And actually, I would say the downturn made us stronger in the end, because we actually understood what it meant to survive in lean times. And so when things became a little looser and more of the resources were flowing, we had already trimmed down and become super efficient.
Okay, so put away money for a rainy day, yet you're doing a lot of fundraising, right?
Yep.
So tell me about that. Are you out in New York City every night, going to parties? What was your hustle there?
My hustle. obviously fundraising is a social kind of a job. So yeah, there is some going out to events, but more than anything, it's about cultivating relationships. And to be honest, I don't love going out to events in the evening, but I think what it is for me.
But you did it.
But I did it. There was a lot of stuff. I had to do it. Someone had to do it, so I did it. But I would say that the cornerstone, the key to my success with fundraising was about relationships. It was about finding the people who wanted to partner with you, keeping our board apprised, keeping them close, keeping them committed to the cause, finding people who believed in what we did, talking about the impact that we made in the world, and honestly, just doing what we said we were going to do and being authentic and trustworthy and likable and all of the things that's important for fundraising.
Okay, so 2008, how do you feel that you got out of that to move to the next step, and what was the next step in the growth?
So I would say that the next step of the growth was, so I remember back in the early days when I was just a baby ED, I went to speak to Rich Berlin, who runs this great organization that used to be called Harlem RBI, but is now called DREAM. And at that point, I think he was raising like $8 million a year. And he's like this very, larger than life character. And he looks at me, I'm this little baby ED, like, Rich, I don't know what to do. And he goes, Rhea, there's nothing harder in this world than raising a budget under $1 million. And I was like, I don't really know what to do with that information. At that time, I was raising a $300,000 budget.
A year.
And
from about how many different people? Are these like $100 grand a chunk? Are these like?
No, it was all over the map. We had foundation funders that were anywhere from 10 to 25, and then lots of individuals who were giving in like anywhere from, our smallest gift was probably like $20 up to maybe 10,000. So it was a lot of smaller gifts.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is Rich Berlin was right, and I will say this on the record, which is once we hit $1 million, we were in a little bit of a different ballpark because it was about as much work. The difference was we could ask for bigger gifts.
Now, why is that? Like, is it?
Why can we ask for bigger gifts?
Yeah, is it just that? Like,
well, so in a philosophical way, many institutional donors don't want to be that big a percentage of your overall because they feel like it creates an over-reliance, and if they don't fund anymore, the organization is at risk, which is true. And so when you're a $300,000 organization, to ask for a $10,000 gift is a reasonable percentage of your budget, whereas asking for, when you're a $2 million organization, you can ask for a $50,000 gift and still maintain that percentage point. Yeah, so a lot of funders, particularly institutional funders, so foundations and corporations as examples, are very wary, and rightfully so, of being too big a percentage of your budget. So presumably, let's just say, for example, if you are a $300,000 a year organization and you ask for a $100,000 gift, it's going to be very hard to come by because a foundation probably won't want to be 30% of your overall.
Because what's their concern?
Well, their concern is if they stop funding, the organization is no longer viable.
Let me just be devil's advocate.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing something good. You're doing something that they feel is interesting and worthwhile.
Right.
Why not just give you the money and just see what happens? Like,
well, a couple. It's an interesting question. A couple of different reasons. I think foundations in general tend to be very conservative.
Yeah.
They also realize that by being overrepresented in any one organization's portfolio, that it creates over-reliance and therefore makes an organization vulnerable, which is true. However, that being said, I've always been an advocate of foundations acting more like VCs and taking bets on jockeys and big ideas.
Okay, so your budget started around $200,000 when you first came to New York. And then the recession hits. How long did it take to grow it? And
well, it was very interesting. I actually think we grew that next year. It was I mean, it was relatively small growth, but we still grew. And I think in part, and this is sort of interesting, and which is why this downturn is sort of fascinating to me, is it actually cleared the playing field for a lot of the weaker organizations that weren't sustainable. So in some ways, it lessened the competition for money, and at the same time,
of course,
organization or foundations still had to give away 5% of their endowment interest. So
I literally cannot wait for the next economic recession for a variety of reasons. One, all of the young whippersnappers who have never seen adversity, will get cleared out. I can't wait for that.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's like winter is coming, right? And,
yes.
and the strong will survive. And so, we were lucky enough that we had a strong enough foundation and money put away and a strong enough case for support that when winter came, and winter came hard, we survived. Now, that being said, we were also a very small fish in a very large pond, right? Like, if we'd been the big tuna, we might have gotten taken out. But as it was, it cleared the playing field. So I think as we think about the economic downturn, I think some very interesting things will happen.
But before we get into projection and speculating, so your growth, like, was it 200,000 one year, $1 million the next year? Like, what was
No, it was like, I can't even remember, it was so long ago. It was like it was sort of anywhere from 12 to 30% year to year.
Yeah, and were you adding like a new employee a year?
I was adding new I don't know if it was a new employee per year, but it was sort of, it sort of went by fits and starts. It was like a step function, I feel like. It was, we'd see like pretty big growth and then we'd like stable out for a while. So what we did do in 2000 and, gosh, let me think, what year was it? 2012? Is that what year it was? Yeah. 2012, we added an additional site in Brooklyn.
Which is where we are.
Which is where we are, beautiful. We opened the site in Fort Greene. And then in 2014, I believe, we opened our third site in the South Bronx. So with growth, it was adding additional sites. So we grew both vertically and horizontally. So at the same time that we were growing the number of kids that we were serving, we were also deepening our commitment. So initially, we were a 2-year program, then we were a 3-year program, then we were a 6-year program, and by the time I left, we were a 10-year program.
Now, was that your choice, or was that like a group choice?
Yeah, I mean, it was driven by me, but ultimately it was the board's decision because I made a very strong case that if we're really going to get to our outcomes about making sure that kids are graduating from college, then we need to be there to support that. And I think the defining moment really came during a board meeting when I asked the board, well, how many of you are planning on dropping your kids off at college and saying, all right, see you in 4 years? Nobody raised their hand, and the question was, well, if that's not what you're expecting to do with your own children, how can we expect to do that with other people's children? And I think that was the moment that we all really stood shoulder to shoulder and decided that our kids deserved support all the way through until they got out of college.
Cool.
Now, there were some dissenting opinions, of course.
These are big giants. These are like not made for humans.
I know.
These are made for basketball players, these steps.
So, but I think the other thing that's interesting is success begets success. So the more we were able to show that we were successful in our model, the more our reputation grew, the more our brand grew, the more people knew us, the more likely they were to fund us and give donations.
Now, were there competitive, you were talking about the fish getting cleared and not being the big tuna, but were there competitive organizations doing the same thing?
Absolutely. So
and vying for the same resources, as you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's one that's particularly well known called Prep for Prep.
Of course, I know. There were kids in my high school who were in Prep for Prep.
Yeah, I mean, and they're very well regarded. And I think the challenge for us was to carve out our own niche in a competitive market and to help educate people about the ways in which we were different. But look, the truth of the matter is, there's enough room for everybody. And so I think it's weird for me when people talk about competition in a nonprofit sense, because at the end of the day, like, there's a lot of need and there are a lot of kids and there's a lot of wealth in this country. And so, yes, I think there's an extent to which we are vying for the same resources. And I think that if we're doing our jobs and articulating our outcomes and connecting to the right community, then there's enough room for all of us.
Okay, so you've expanded to 3 locations: the Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan.
So Brooklyn was, 2012. The South Bronx was like 2015, I want to say. It's all blurring together now in my mind.
So South Bronx 2015, you are at a scale that you've never been before.
Right.
And tell me some of the challenges. About scaling up like that.
Yeah, so many lessons learned. I think one of the key ones is you have to fix the plumbing before you can talk about the poetry. And so what that means is I think one of the mistakes I learned was that it sounds so obvious, but like, you can't run a 3-site organization the same way that you ran a 1-site organization. And what that means is, like, we really, in retrospect, probably needed to do a lot more building of infrastructure before we grew. And
well, the analogy that's really most sticking out to me is this this dumpling chain that I wanted to invest in. And instead I bought a house.
Okay.
But they had 3 locations. Now they have a 4th location. And in that 4th location, they have a central kitchen, where they can go and, do things in a more factory model. Like, the central kitchen does all the appetizers. Yep. So you were talking about infrastructure. So tell me what that's like in your case.
Yeah. So what that means for me, what that meant was thinking about investing in things that scaled across different sites. So that means HR procedures and policies. That meant tech infrastructure to track outcomes. It meant a much more robust way of fundraising, so that we can, we knew what was happening at each site. But what's interesting, and I think this was a hard lesson learned too, was because we're dealing with human beings, it's really difficult to scale relationships. And so because our model was so relationship dependent, I think inevitably when you grow, you see some staff turnover. And I think in our case, we definitely saw that staff turnover result in some program quality issues, not because the people that we had were not doing a good job. It was more that so much of the value of our services were in the relationships that the kids and families cultivated with individual staff members. And I think, I kind of was in a little bit of a factory mindset of like, oh, well, if there are these people who are producing the same kind of services, it'll be the same. But it's not the same, because we're human beings and we attach to other human beings.
Okay, so you have 3 sites. And you have one person to run each site?
We have one person running each site, and then we have one person at the central office sort of overseeing each of the individuals running all of the sites. And then we have services that are sort of cross sites, so things like high school placement or SAT preparation or what have you. So I think if there was any sort of lesson learned, lots of lessons learned, is about investing in making sure the plumbing is right. I think also being intentional about culture was a real hard lesson learned, because I did not appreciate fully the extent to which I was depending on proximity to carry culture. So in the early days, when it was like 3 or 5 of us working in an office, people knew me, right? And so I didn't feel like I had to articulate my point of view or my values or what I thought the organization was about, because these are people who knew me and worked alongside me. But as we got bigger...
Let's take a seat for a second, eh?
Yeah, I think that'd be great. It would have been helpful to articulate culture in a really explicit way.
As I recall, you had a crisis.
Did I have a crisis? When did I have a crisis?
Didn't you say like a lot of your staff quit on you?
Oh, that crisis. Yeah.
So when did that happen?
That probably happened around 2000, what year are we? Maybe 2016, 2015, 2016 was kind of when we hit a critical mass.
Now, what break that down for me.
Yeah, so a couple different things there. I think on the one hand, I was hiring people and promoting people into management positions without giving them the proper tools and supervision and context for them to be able to do their jobs well. So I think this is what happens in a lot of organizations, which is like, oh, you were really good at this one job, so I'm going to promote you to be a manager of the things.
Yes.
And
so when the management comes more money.
With management comes more money, but without being explicit about the skills needed to be a manager versus like the doer of the thing. I think we saw some difficulty and challenges there. I think the other piece is a couple different things. I think, there were some folks that were not great hires that I think I held on to longer than I should have, and I sort of held on to them because it was just sort of easier to
to have them do the work as opposed to get lean again. Exactly.
Well, and also just like I kept coming back to this idea of like hope is not a strategy. Like I just kept hoping that they would get better, and they didn't necessarily on their own. And then the other piece is I was spending a lot more time outside of the organization fundraising because as the budget grew, the need for raising money grew, and I kind of expected that things would kind of take care of themselves, and it didn't. So I think that really contributed to. So if I can recap, it would be not providing enough training and context for folks to move into management roles. It was not being explicit about the culture and the expectations. It was holding on to people too long who were not suited to their jobs, and it was not, frankly, paying enough attention to the internal mechanisms of the organization because I was so externally focused.
Okay, so one of the themes of this show, and I know I've only had 5 episodes, but is like a lot of startup founders, they love to bring in an organization from 1 to like 7 or 10 people, but then they hate having to deal with it after that. Now, do you think you're better at that growth phase as opposed to the mature, general giant company?
Yes, 100%. Actually, it's so funny you mention it because I just wrote a blog piece on this, which is, I think the skills and temperament that are really conducive to startups are not necessarily the skills that you need in order to grow and sustain a company. And so I liken it to, I'm really good at building a train and figuring out a blueprint. I am not that good, and frankly, I'm not that interested in making sure that train runs on time. And what's interesting is in a lot of cases, not just a nonprofit, but also across the board, you run into founder syndrome, where the skills and assets of the founder end up being a liability because, what got them there will not necessarily get them to the next level. And so, for me, I realized that it was time for me to go for a bunch of different reasons. A, the fact that I'd been there for 12 and a half years. B, that I think what the organization needed was not necessarily something I was good at or particularly wanted to do. And C, I just kept getting sidetracked by all these like shiny new ideas. And it was really because in my heart, I'm a startup entrepreneur, and I kept kind of throwing out these projects because I was bored, but frankly, it didn't serve the organization because the organization needed to stick to its lane and do what it did best. The real key is for startup funders to get honest with themselves about what it is they're good at and what they enjoy doing, and then have the humility and the self-awareness to pass on the torch if they want their company or their organization to live beyond them.
Okay, so how did you know it was time to leave?
So a lot of what I talked about, it was realizing that I had sort of lost that loving feeling. I mean, in the early days of Scale, like I said, it was really hard, but it was really exciting. And then, as we got bigger and the funding sort of became more predictable and the staff stabilized and so on, I found that I just wasn't as excited to go to work as I used to be. I wasn't jumping out of bed and percolating with a million ideas, and I just realized that I wasn't really utilizing all of the skills and interests and passions that I had for growing. And so I told the board 6 months in advance of leaving that I was tendering my resignation, and we launched a search with the search firm. We found a really fantastic new leader, and I was able to step away last year feeling really good about what I had built and feeling like it was in good hands. And so now I'm in the process of building a new company.
So I would call that an honorable discharge.
It was an honorable discharge. Sometimes I actually just wrote a blog piece about it, which is I've titled it, "A Lady Always Knows When to Leave a Party."
I love it.
And so this lady knew it was time to go, and it was a good run. I had a lot of fun, had some great dance partners, and it was time to exit gracefully.
So, what do you see on the horizon for your future?
If I knew that, I would be, well, a couple of different things. I'm right now working on my own consulting firm for nonprofits. I have a podcast, I have a blog, and I'm actually working on writing a book. So, we'll see what the future holds, but I'm really enjoying being in the wild and exploring lots of new fun projects and having really interesting conversations with people who are doing really interesting things, and we'll see what happens next.
All right. Go check out Rhea's podcast.
RheaWong.com.
What's the name of the podcast?
Oh, the podcast is called Nonprofit Lowdown, available on all of the different sites: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher.
So go check out Nonprofit Lowdown, Rhea's podcast, where she's talking to people that are interesting and that a lot of interesting conversations. And I look forward to having you on here when you're like the CEO of UNICEF or the next UNICEF, because you don't actually want to be the CEO.
I don't actually want to be the CEO.
But
I think whoever
I want to see what your next thing is. Sorry to cut you off.
Oh yeah, no, I'm happy to be on. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.